Rose. I'm a member of the Creation Task Force. And on behalf of the task force, I want to welcome you all to today's forum, Aldo Leopold and Shifting Paradigms of Wildlife Conservation with Dr. Stan Temple. And as we're celebrating Earth Day, yesterday was officially Earth Day, April 22nd. Today on Earth Sunday, we brought down some environment-themed books from the church library that are in the back of the room. And we encourage you to take a look at those and check one out to bring home. We have some great titles. Right after the forum, you can join the worship hike at the UW Arboretum. Folks will be gathering on the steps at the visitor center between 10:30 and 10:45. And just a heads up, looking ahead, we're planning a bike or walk to church Sunday on June 4th. And so we'll have more information about that, but we encourage you as you're able to participate in that on June 4th. So our discussion today, led by Dr. Stan Temple, explores shifts in wildlife conservation from protecting to managing, very much influenced by Aldo Leopold's work in the 1930s. And then from there, how our thinking has evolved in conservation to incorporate our understanding of our relationships with wildlife, our place in nature, and an understanding of the ecological context in which wildlife exists. So if you've ever been to the Shack in Baraboo or spent, that's where the Leopold family spent many weekends throughout the year restoring the land, or perhaps nearby on the Wisconsin River to see the congregating sandhill cranes, you may have encountered Stan Temple. I was fortunate to meet Stan about a decade ago when we moved to Madison, and he introduced me to the Shack, the cranes, and to the Aldo Leopold Foundation. So a little bit about Stan. He is the Beers-Bascom Professor Emeritus in Conservation in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology and former chairman of the Conservation Biology and Sustainable Development Program in the Gaylord Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at UW-Madison. For 32 years, he held the academic position once occupied by Aldo Leopold. He's currently a senior fellow with the Aldo Leopold Foundation. And Stan has received major conservation awards from the Society for Conservation Biology, the Wildlife Society, and the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology. And among other recognitions of his achievements, he's a fellow of multiple scientific societies and was inducted into the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame in 2020. Stan is very generous with his time in speaking about wildlife management and serving as a mentor and communicator in the field of conservation. And we're so grateful that he's able to spend this time with us on a Sunday morning. And thank you, Stan.
Well, this is going to be a history lesson. It's pretty much what you asked for. So what you are going to get is an explanation of how central Aldo Leopold and his ideas have been in the history of wildlife conservation. And even though he's been dead for 75 years, it's remarkable how strong his influence remains on the future and how we think about conservation going forward. So I'm going to focus on Aldo Leopold. And how many of you read St. County Almanac? Oh, quite good. Okay, so you know who Aldo Leopold is. I don't need to really go into great detail about who he is, but the idea of paradigms might be something that needs a little explanation. And I'm going to sort of couch today's presentation as shifting paradigms, the way we have changed our views about wildlife conservation over time. A paradigm is essentially a worldview. It's how you view the world. It's a lens through which you interpret everything that you see. It's how you respond to the environment. And the classic example is Aristotle, who thought the Earth was the center of the universe. And if you're in the paradigm that the Earth is the center of the universe, that completely alters the way you view astronomy, for example. But as is typically the case, paradigms don't last forever. Eventually, people start to find weaknesses in the prevailing paradigm. Astronomers started to realize, boy, we can't reconcile what we're actually observing with the Earth being the center of the universe. So it fell to Copernicus centuries later to shift the paradigm and say, no, the Earth isn't the center of the universe. The sun is the center of our universe. And that completely changed how people viewed the world in the universe. So for Leopold, we're going to talk about shifting paradigms, worldviews in conservation. And you've probably, there's something coming up here that's not my doing. Okay. For some reason, I have lost control of my computer. Let's do it this way. There we go. You've probably all seen this cartoon, but it illustrates something related to paradigms. And that is, two people can look at the same thing and see something totally different. And that's what happens when you're operating within different paradigms. You can look at the same problem, but see something different. Some people see a rabbit, some people see a duck. So moving on to the shifting paradigms of wildlife conservation, we can go all the way back to early colonial times, pre-paradigm times. The 1700s, no one was thinking about wildlife conservation. It wasn't on anyone's radar screen. There was no prevailing worldview about our relationship with wildlife. But in the 1800s, a paradigm emerged, the inexhaustible resources paradigm. The worldview was that the wildlife and other natural resources of North America were limitless and inexhaustible, and therefore our relationship with those natural resources could be one of exploitation without concern. That lasted for most of the 19th century, but eventually that proved itself to be an unworkable, untenable paradigm, and the paradigm shifted to a worldview of, oh my gosh, we've wrecked the place. We need to protect those valuable resources that we've devastated. And the protectionism paradigm emerged, in which we tried to protect things from overexploitation. Eventually, that proved to be unworkable, and a new paradigm emerged in the 1930s that we could call the resource management paradigm. Instead of just protecting things, we actively engaged with those resources and tried to manage them. Eventually, that paradigm wore out. And in the 1960s, the new paradigm, the environmental paradigm, said, hey, we've got to be paying attention to more than just natural resources. We have to be paying attention to the entire environment and wildlife within that environment. So these are the paradigms that I'm going to take us through, and particularly, of course, looking at Aldo Leopold's position on these different paradigms. In some cases, he was a firm believer. In other cases, he was a leader in shifting the paradigm. In other cases, he shifted his own paradigm as he evolved over time. So if we think about Leopold's life from 1887 to 1948, he lived to basically see most of the prevailing paradigms. And as I said, was an influence on most of them. As a boy, he witnessed the overexploitation of that inexhaustible resource paradigm. When he was entering the profession of conservation, he was very much part of the protectionism paradigm. He then led the shift to a management-focused paradigm, and then evolved again and led the shift to environmentalism, although he never lived to see that paradigm actually take full form. So as I said, he, as a young person, was witness to the horrible destruction that came from this idea that resources were limited. He saw the North American bison reduced from millions to hundreds. He saw the passenger pigeon reduced from billions to none. He saw the forests of the north central states clear cut. In other words, these were big events that influenced a young Aldo Leopold, and especially since he came from a family that had quite a conservation focus. And the fact that he was sort of coming of age during the period in which protectionism was starting to emerge, we can sort of zero in on a point in which Aldo Leopold's own words reveal where he is at the time. Here he is as a schoolboy back east in boarding school. I'm very sorry that the ducks are being slaughtered as usual, that open access, inexhaustible resource. But of course, could expect nothing else. When my turn comes to have something to say and do against it and other related matters, I am sure that nothing in my power will be lacking to the good cause. I'm not sure many of us, when we were 15 years old, could have so accurately prophesized where we were headed in our life. But he did want to pursue a career in conservation. At the time, the only university training that you could get was in forestry. He was one of the first classes in forestry at the Yale Forest School, and like all of his classmates, was immediately on graduation hired to work in the brand new Forest Service. And Leopold spent the first half of his career in the U.S. Forest Service, working mostly in the Southwest and Arizona and New Mexico. But as soon as he takes up his professional position in 1909, the paradigm has already started to shift towards protectionism. People realize that, oh my gosh, we caused the most abundant bird in the world, the passenger pigeon, to go extinct because of our excessive overexploitation. We've got to do something. And the knee-jerk reaction and the shift of the paradigm was, we've got to protect these valuable resources from direct harm by people. And oh, by the way, we've also got to protect these valuable resources from anything else that might threaten them. So fire for forests, predators for wildlife were viewed as threats to these valuable natural resources. And we started to see at the turn of the last century, the first inklings of an American conservation movement with legal protection for natural resources. So the Lacey Act, which was designed to curb the commercial exploitation of wildlife. National Audubon Society formed to protect birds. We had national wildlife refuges created. We had the Migratory Bird Treaty Act as the first federal legislation that actively protected wildlife. And state programs expanded. Suddenly there was a cadre of people whose job was game warden. They were there to enforce laws that were protecting nature. And Leopold was part and parcel of this. He was gung-ho on protection. It was the prevailing paradigm and the one that he operated in as a young person in the Forest Service. Just a couple of newspaper clippings. Even though he was in the Forest Service, his passion was really wildlife conservation, and he's giving lots of talks about game protection, protecting wildlife species that are valued because they're game species, because we can use them as natural resources. So Leopold is on board. He's a big advocate for protection, but because Leopold is a restless person and always thinking, he realizes that, gee, maybe protection isn't everything that's needed for wildlife conservation. And he starts to think about a new paradigm. And it shows up early in his time in the Forest Service here when he writes an essay about game conservation, that the American people have already answered in the vigorous affirmative the question of whether our game shall be conserved. Game conservation is ready to enter its second stage, and even the layman is beginning to ask how it shall be accomplished. Leopold is going to tell him how it's going to be accomplished. And here's where he sees the future lying. Remember, he was trained as a forester. He was trained as someone who managed forests. So for Leopold, he makes the key observation here that all those things that I learned in forestry school can be applied to wildlife. Game management problems are absolutely parallel to forest management problems, and the underlying principles are not merely parallel, they are identical. What he's basically saying here is that protection alone is not solving the problems. We need to take a much more active approach. And he really does make the contrast between passive protection and active management. Game, to be successfully conserved, must be positively managed rather than negatively protected. Protection is a passive thing. Management is very active, engaging you in managing wildlife. So Leopold is seeing that that next stage of wildlife conservation is going to involve management rather than protection per se. Yes, we'll continue to protect wildlife when it needs protecting, but in general, the way forward for wildlife conservation is management. In 1927, Leopold has an epiphany, I suppose you could call it. He reads this little book by Charles Elton called Animal Ecology. Ecology is a really young science. Animals were not really the subject of a lot of the early ecologists. They were mostly plant ecologists. Charles Elton writes this book interpreting ecology in an animal context. And for Leopold, this was like the light bulb going off. My gosh, here are the scientific foundations of all the things that I've been figuring out by the seat of my pants having to do with wildlife conservation. There's a science that underpins all the things that I've been thinking about. So Leopold is actually one of the first individuals to realize the tremendous potential of linking the science of ecology with the practice of conservation. And obviously, that is an incredibly sort of productive linkage. So for Leopold, after he quits the Forest Service in 1948, he does this game survey of the north central states. He travels all over the Great Lakes states, looking at conditions on the ground, looking at the status of wildlife and what wildlife conservation was doing at the time. And when he took this contract job, the expectation was that he was going to discover that it was a failure of protection, that wildlife was in such miserable shape in the Midwest. Hard to believe. White-tailed deer were virtually gone from the landscape. Wild turkeys were. It was really a low point in terms of wildlife populations across the Midwest. And the prevailing paradigm said it must be because we're not protecting them well enough. Go out, Aldo Leopold, you're this young, impressive thinker, and confirm that the protectionism paradigm has been failing. Leopold went out and comes home and writes a very different report in which he concludes that it had nothing to do with a failure of protection. It wasn't that hunting seasons were too long, that bag limits were too large, that there weren't enough game wardens, that there was too much poaching. He said, has nothing to do with a failure of protection. It has everything to do with the condition of the habitat. That's the ecology influence now playing a role. Leopold recognizing that, of course, wildlife isn't thriving in the Midwest. We've destroyed most of its habitat. And if we're going to turn things around, the one and only thing we can do is to make the environment more favorable. It's the fundamental truth which the conservation movement must learn if it's to attain its objective. So Leopold is moving forward. He's about to shift the paradigm now from protectionism, which he was an ardent believer in. He's shifting it to a management paradigm. And as only Leopold could do with written words, he captures almost the moment that the paradigm is shifting. Game conservation is at this moment in a particularly difficult stage of its development. The set of ideas which serve to string out the remnants of the virgin game supply, the protectionism paradigm, and to which many of us feel an intense personal loyalty, seem to have reached the limit of their effectiveness. Something new, which would be the resource management paradigm, must be done. And Leopold is going to lead the way forward in basically promoting that paradigm and making sure that the world realizes that you can't just protect things and succeed. You need to actively intervene and manage. So in 1933, he writes a book game management, which puts all of his new ideas and essentially this new paradigm of managing wildlife in the form of a book. It is the paradigm shifting publication. People in the profession read this and they realize that the world has changed. Actually, from 1933, if you're engaged professionally in wildlife conservation, your job description probably shifted from game warden to wildlife manager. And for Leopold, he's off and running. And he says in the book, again, because it's based on ecological principles, that the subject matter of this book has been hung on a framework of ecological factors rather than of species or land units, because the objective is to portray the mechanism which produces all species on all lands. The key is managing the environment, managing the habitat of wildlife. That's going to be the way forward. So his rising notoriety lands him a position at the University of Wisconsin. He's appointed to a chair, a professorship in this new field of wildlife management that he has essentially just introduced to the world. And he will spend the rest of his professional career as a professor, developing in the only, the academic freedom that a university environment provides. He's able to now sort of fully explore all of his emerging ideas about wildlife conservation. And that quickly leads him to shifting the paradigm that he had just introduced to the world. So the first thing he does is to start realizing that even though the title of my book was Game Management, songbirds and other non-game wildlife are not yet thought of as subject to management. The fact that the objective is something to look at rather than something to shoot, catch, or trap is, from the scientific point of view, irrelevant. So he's saying, wow, my ideas about management don't just apply to wildlife species that we regard as natural resources. It applies to all species in all places. So Leopold is sort of initially expanding his paradigm, but then he starts to think more about this expansion of the idea, and he realizes that we really should expand it further and not just be thinking about wildlife per se or game. We should be thinking broader about the environment. And here again is Aldo Leopold introducing a paradigm shift in a couple of sentences. We've seen the emergence of two kinds of conservation and two systems of thought on the subject. One kind feels a primary interest in some one aspect of land, and land is the term that Leopold was using for the environment, the ecosystem, the whole. Some one aspect of land, such as soil, forest, game, or fish, with an incidental interest in the land as a whole. The other feels a primary interest in the land as a whole, with incidental interest in its component resources. Leopold is moving on beyond managing resources to managing land, to managing the environment. Wildlife will benefit, obviously, if we manage the environment appropriately. It's amazing how this guy can use words so succinctly and capture something so perfectly in a few sentences. I mean, and here he does it again, sort of describing the paradigm shift that he's about to introduce. And it is a very holistic concept of land. And remember, land is the term that Leopold was using for what today we might say is the ecosystem or even the environment. So he says conservation is a state of health. By the way, Leopold provided dozens and dozens of definitions of what conservation is. So I'm cherry picking here to illustrate the point. But conservation is a state of health in the land. The land consists of soil, water, plants, and animals. And land health is more than a sufficiency of these components. It is a state of vigorous self-renewal in each of them and in all collectively. He's thinking holistically. He's now thinking big about the environment. And he's puzzled. How do we get people to engage in conservation of such a big thing? It was not hard to get people engaged in protecting and managing natural resources because those are things that we directly consume. They're things that are clearly valuable to us. But now we're talking about something that's very big and for many people may not immediately present a way, well, how do you do that? How would you get people to be concerned about the environment? And Leopold really puzzles about how to do this. And he comes up with something, again, almost uniquely Leopoldian in its novelty. And that is that our approach to conservation going forward has to be based on ethics. It has to be based on some kind of moral compass, if you will, of what's right and wrong for human beings to do on this planet. It can't be based just on laws, on regulations. It can't just be based on selfish interest, on our own self-interest. It has to be based on something like ethics. And as he said, we seem always throwing back on individual ethic as the basis for land conservation. So as many of you know, what many consider to be his most important contribution is his land ethic. The idea that there has to be an ethic that governs how people live on this planet. And he described it as a land ethic then reflects the existence of an ecological conscience, a moral compass that tells you what's right or wrong. And this in turn reflects a conviction of individual responsibility for the health of the land. Health is the capacity of the land for self-renewal. Conservation is our effort to understand and preserve this capacity. Leopold is moving forward now to thinking not so much as an ecologist, he's thinking more like a philosopher here, an ethicist, and thinking that the way forward really does have to involve a change in our human relationship with the land, with the environment. Leopold, of course, is a realist. And as he's thinking about these big ideas in the 1940s, he's realizing that what I'm talking about really requires a fundamental change in the way human beings have existed on this planet since we became a species. I'm really talking about sort of developing a new kind of people who will have a very different relationship with the world than we have in the past. So another one of Leopold's definitions of conservation, conservation is a state of harmony between men and land. Well, that's a nice succinct definition, but then just a couple of sentences later, he pulls the plug, pulls the rug out from under you. We shall never achieve harmony with land any more than we shall achieve justice or liberty for all people. In these higher aspirations, the important thing is not to achieve, but to strive. He's likening what he's talking about in our relationship with the environment in the same way that we consider our relationship with each other, that there has to be a caring for other people, that we have to respect human rights, that we have to have a caring relationship with the rest of people. And Aldo is saying in the same way that we live in human communities in which a code of ethics has to govern how the community functions, there has to be a very similar code of ethics that govern how we live in the ecological community, how we live in the environment, how we treat the plants and animals and soils and waters around us. So he's now sort of come, you might say, almost full circle. He's reached the point where he's going to die in 1968 or 1948. So he's leaving us his last words of wisdom. So you can sort of see what I've already explained, how Leopold has changed over time. In 1916, when he's stuck in the protectionism paradigm and believing that predators are horrible and we need to kill predators because they're eating game species. It's going to take patience and money to catch the last wolf or lion in New Mexico, but the last one must be caught before the job can be called fully successful. Leopold wants to get rid of predators because they're a threat to game species, and he wants to protect game species. And then you look at him in the Sand County Almanac, harmony with land is like harmony with a friend. You cannot cherish his right hand and chop off his left. You cannot love game and hate predators. Leopold has come essentially almost full circle during his life. He dies in 1948 of a heart attack at the age 61. He's introduced this holistic idea of looking at our relationship with the environment. He's introduced the idea that it will only work if we have a moral compass. He doesn't live to see this paradigm actually emerge. People weren't ready at the time to hear his words and understand. But by the 1960s, suddenly we got what Leopold was talking about. And suddenly this paradigm that he had essentially prophesized emerges, the environmentalism paradigm. In the 1960s and 1970s, we do all of these major shifts in policy and legislation that are dealing not with protecting natural resources per se, or managing natural resources, but that are focused on broader environmental issues. And by the 1980s, we start to really think big about things like biodiversity and climate change and all of these big global issues that we have to tackle. And environmentalism, being the prevailing paradigm, had to basically try to deal with these issues. And certainly for wildlife conservation, one of the Leopold's obviously main interests, this meant that wildlife per se often was being managed and protected under this arching umbrella of biodiversity and ecosystem health. Wildlife, yes, was important in its own right, but if we do a good job of dealing with these big overarching issues, wildlife will pretty much take care of itself. So in Leopold's own words, remember the essay, Conservation in Whole or in Part, the whole is becoming increasingly as important as the parts in our policies and practice. And by the 1960s, Leopold is recognized for his far-sighted thinking. Reflecting that, his book, A Sand County Almanac, published in 1949, hardly sold at all during the 1950s. In fact, the book had been rejected by multiple publishers because they said, we don't think there's a readership for this type of book. Oxford University Press took a gamble, but the other publishers were right. It wasn't the right time for Leopold's ideas to really take hold. It wasn't until the 1960s that there was suddenly a readership ready to read a Sand County Almanac and understand what this guy was talking about. Since then, Sand County Almanac sales have been exponential because it has become the sort of Bible almost of the modern environmental movement. So we're in the environmentalism paradigm, but as I said in the beginning, paradigms don't last forever. Eventually, chinks start to show up in the armor. The weaknesses of the paradigm start to emerge, and the paradigm inevitably shifts. And we're seeing lots of signs of trouble with the environmentalism paradigm. There's certainly been a huge erosion of science and an expansion of special interests when it comes to wildlife conservation and other environmental policies. There's controversy over wildlife conservation. We don't seem to be able to agree on what we should do with species like wolves or what we should do with wildlife on public lands. There's a change in how wildlife conservation is funded. Up to the present, it's been funded largely by consumptive users of wildlife who pay by their license fees and excise taxes on their sporting equipment. They pay for most wildlife conservation. The rest of us sort of get off without paying our fair share, but that's starting to change. And that's a big change for wildlife conservation, because consumptive users said, hey, we're paying for wildlife conservation. We should get priority. Most of us who are not consumptive users say, hey, wait a minute, we need to broaden the base of support. Environmentalism hasn't worked in terms of halting the ongoing deterioration of the environment. So the signs are there for a paradigm shift. And the most important flaw really with environmentalism, as the way we sort of put it into practice, is that it's still tackling the problems piecemeal. We've still got a Clean Air Act. We've still got a Clean Water Act. We've still got an Endangered Species Act. We're tackling the problems sort of one at a time. We're swatting out little spot fires rather than dealing with the big underlying issues, the systemic problems that are behind all these issues. Too many of us on this planet, the fact that we're consuming natural resources in an unsustainable way, our affluence is leading us to overexploit. And finally, that we use technologies that are incredibly damaging to the environment. And environmentalism simply isn't tackling these big issues. The crystal ball is kind of murky, but one might imagine that the next paradigm is going to tackle the big underlying issues and say, look, we can't deal with all of these individually. We've got to deal with them systemically. So for Leopold, I'm going to, end with some parting words here. We end, I think, at what might be called the standard paradox of our time. Our tools are better than we are and grow better faster than we do. They suffice to crack the atom, to command the tides, but they do not suffice for the oldest task in human history, to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. Or to put it into an Earth Day context, the oldest task in human history is to live on planet Earth without spoiling it. Thank you. That was a lot to cover in 35 minutes, but.
I was just thinking during your talk about invasive species, and I was wondering maybe what Leopold's
thought
thoughts were
about
on that.
This is a question people, regardless of what the issue in the environment might be, it's a common question. What would Aldo Leopold have said about fill in the blank? And of course, in many cases, something like global climate change, he wasn't aware of, so he really didn't have anything very specific to say about it. The case of invasive species, he did. And he wrote a couple of key papers about invasive species and the damage that they do to the environment. But he was also an astute enough observer to realize that not all non-native species are bad, and that there can be benefits for the environment for certain non-native species, just as there can be tremendous damage from others. So he made the distinction of species that are ecologically harmful and species that are ecologically benign. But his most important essay about invasive species ties in the environment, economics, people, and it was about cheatgrass taking over the Western grasslands. The title's Cheat Takes Over, and he describes all of the consequences of this invasive species taking over the grasslands of the West. Good question.
Yeah, since he started in forestry, one of the issues has been the sort of long-term suppression of any kind of forest fires as a way, and that's become perhaps a seed of greater problems to come. And certainly preserving deer in our state sometimes has led to overpopulation and damage to forests as well. And so I'm just that's sort of the clash, I guess, between the protection part as well as the
Yeah.
integration of, all these environmental factors. And I wondered if that was something that he had commented on during his life in terms of, forest fires and those sorts of things.
He was one of the first, when he was working in the Forest Service in Arizona and New Mexico, he wrote a paper that was 75 years ahead of its time, describing, remember, he's in charge of, he's a young guy, he's in charge of millions of acres of newly created national forests. And he writes this paper that says the way we're managing the national forest isn't working. We can't manage national forests as just a source of natural resources to be harvested for timber, to be grazed, to be mined. He said, no, we need to be managing them as ecosystems. And he talks about the ecosystems of the Southwest. And one of the things he points out is that suppressing fire is damaging the health of these ecosystems. Fire is natural. We need to let fires burn rather than the protectionism paradigm of, oh my gosh, we've got to protect these forests from fire. Deer were one of Leopold's sort of failures. In the early 1940s, he was appointed to the Wisconsin Conservation Commission. One of the few times in the history of that institution that someone who actually had expertise in wildlife was appointed. They're usually political appointees. Leopold arrived, and in the 1940s, he was an astute enough ecologist to see that the deer herd is starting to erupt. I can see the signs in the deer population that it's starting to get out of control. He said, now is the time to control it, because if we wait much longer, the deer herd will become so large that we won't be able to use our most effective tool, which is hunting, to keep the population in check. And he recommended something that was heretical. He said the easiest way to do this is to start harvesting does rather than bucks. It exploded on him. He was headlines. Leopold, the Bambi killer. His proposal had the misfortune of occurring simultaneously with Disney's movie Bambi. And worse than that, of course, it was World War II. So the other headline was Leopold, the Nazi in the woods. I mean, he was just pilloried in the press for his view, which of course was absolutely correct, but he was ignored. And we know what happened. The deer herd did just what Leopold predicted. It increased to the point where we've lost control of it, where we simply can't keep the numbers at ecologically responsible levels using hunting as a tool.
How prophetic was that? Where were the deer then?
Oh, deer were pretty scarce back then. I mean, by today's standards, they were probably less than 10% of the density that they are at today. But Leopold could see the handwriting. He could see clearly what was happening because he'd seen it happen in the Southwest. He'd seen the failure of protection let a deer population explode and damage the ecosystem.
Wasn't that also because we had killed off all the wolves?
It certainly didn't help that wolves were on the way out in the 1940s. But we have to recognize that in the Wisconsin of the 1940s and today, we can't rely on wolves to control the deer population. Deer live in places where wolves aren't going to be able to deal with them. I mean, they'll probably wander through your property here at some point. Yeah.
This may be a sideline, but I'm wondering, when did the Menominee become involved with their forestry of a sustained yield basis?
Yeah.
And to what extent would Aldo Leopold have been involved or not involved in that? And what kinds of lessons, given what's now happening with that land up around Rhinelander and to the east?
Yeah, it's an interesting question of Leopold's relationship with indigenous peoples, with Native Americans. And there are some parallels between some of the philosophies of Native Americans and Leopold's philosophy. There's no evidence that he sort of borrowed from Native Americans. He came to his own conclusions based on ecology based on science rather than on traditions. But there were parallels in terms of sustainability. He did not interact intensely with the Menominee at the time. He had closer contacts with the Ho-Chunk because, of course, his shack, Madison, the places that he frequented were Ho-Chunk land. And some of you know that Leopold, when he got his job at the university, one of his responsibilities was to be the director of the newly created Arboretum. And one of the things that he did, sort of, I think, reflecting his respect for Native Americans' culture of managing the land, at the dedication of the Arboretum, he invited the local Ho-Chunk chief to speak, which most people were, why are you having an Indian speak at the dedication of the Arboretum? And it was out of respect. But the Ho-Chunk tradition of managing their forest to sustain the resources that they traditionally depend on has a much longer history than Aldo Leopold. And certainly the way they manage the Menominee forest is, a beautiful example. I'll give you a personal story. When I built my home in 1980, I wanted to build it out of sustainably harvested wood. At the time, there was no certification to sort of guide me of where in Wisconsin I could obtain sustainably harvested wood. But I recognized that the Menominee were meeting my standards of sustainability. So I bought all of the wood in my house from the Menominee, everything from the white cedar shingles, the wood in the house, the pine floors, everything came from the Menominee. But at the time, they were just about going bankrupt because they weren't getting a premium reward for sustainably harvesting their forest. Now they're thriving because they're getting a premium for the lumber that they produce sustainably. I always joke, when I built my house, I paid more for the windows that I bought at Menards than I paid for all the wood in the house from the Menominee, to show you how they weren't getting much respect.
As someone who hit a deer with my car, and then subsequently people came out of the woodwork, somebody's told me she'd hit 3 deer with her car. Do you think, that doesn't seem like a good alternative to wolves?
No, hitting deer with cars is not, but in many recent years, deer-car collisions are almost as frequent as car-car collisions. And they do a lot of damage, of course, economic damage, and people are injured and killed. So there are selfish reasons for us to worry about the overpopulation of deer, in addition to the ecological conscience of saying, this is not right to allow this high population of deer to damage the ecosystems of Wisconsin.
So just a question, thinking about the land acquisition issue that was in the news in the past week, and this thinking about publicly owned land and privately owned land. And I'm wondering if, there's a concert, we assume that publicly owned land will be conserved, but maybe it will and maybe it won't. And I'm wondering if there's a balance between public land and private lands that Leopold has talked about that would be helpful to think about.
Boy, that's an entire different talk. Remember, Aldo Leopold spent the first half of his career working on public lands. He was working in the national forests. He spent the second half of his career here in the Midwest working on conservation on privately owned land. So he uniquely had a perspective of how important each of these pieces can actually be. But he did come to a conclusion, and that is that it's inescapable. Most of the US is in private ownership. 82% of the state of Wisconsin is privately owned. You simply cannot achieve conservation goals on public lands in a place like Wisconsin. Public lands have their place, but if you're going to really achieve Leopold's idea of living on a piece of land, living in the state without spoiling it, you're going to have to engage private landowners and do conservation work on private lands. It's inescapable. And most conservation organizations and agencies recognize that reality, that there's only so much we can do on public land, and we have to take care of wildlife and other aspects of the environment that exist sometimes only on privately owned land.
It seems like maybe there's a balance between a conservation organization trying to buy its own land that it can preserve, and then also working with other private landowners to do things the right way, do things a better way, maybe.
Yeah, I think the way to do it is to prioritize the preservation of public lands and use that tool for the most important pieces of the environment that we need to protect. The Nature Conservancy has done that particularly well for decades, in that they prioritize different ecosystems, different species, and prioritize the ones that are most at risk and therefore need the most attention. So absolutely, when we invest money in acquiring more public lands, it would be very wise to invest that money in the places that are really going to make a difference in terms of biodiversity and the overall environment.
Yes, as someone who works with land trusts in the state of Wisconsin, I have to say that just as Stan did, that public lands and private lands really are important pieces of the puzzle. And Wisconsin's land trusts, I work for Gathering Waters, which is the state alliance for land trusts. We have more than 40 member land trusts around the state who partner closely with private landowners as well as agencies and local governments to look at ways to figure out what are priorities for conservation, how can we expand the community that's working in conservation. So I have to put a plug in for that. Stan, I was thinking too that you reflected on how Leopold saw that an ethic around the land really paralleled sort of like the justice and some of those kinds of things. And I'm just wondering, as we're seeing the problems that you outlined with the current environmentalism paradigm, where you might see hopeful new paradigms or maybe coalitions that look like they're taking us into a new era.
Well, certainly, as I presented, the crystal ball is murky. And I guess what I was presenting was not necessarily what I see as happening, but what I think, and I think what Aldo Leopold would agree, has to happen. Environmentalism is still solidly in control. And what it will take for it to shift, like most times a paradigm shifts, is to clearly reveal that the system isn't working as we are using it now. And I think we're starting to realize that, especially something like biodiversity loss and climate change. These are big global issues, and environmentalism simply isn't doing it. It isn't tackling these things. The climate is changing in the wrong direction. Biodiversity is suffering, and environmentalism isn't the solution. My crystal ball says it's only going to change if we change ourselves, if we start to think very differently about our relationship with the natural world in the way that Leopold was thinking, and care about the natural world and use that sort of culture of caring to move us in the direction of tackling these big systemic issues that just aren't being addressed by environmentalism. And we know what those systemic issues are. As I said, it's too many of us, it's our consumption of resources and the damaging technologies that we use. We've got to bring those under control. And I think we're only going to do that as a matter of conscience, that we realize this is wrong. We simply can't continue this way. So my crystal ball doesn't tell me exactly where we're going, but I, as usual, I think Leopold has pointed the way forward.
What are the damaging technologies that you keep mentioning?
Well, we've got a parking lot full of them out there. A carbon-based economy is perhaps the one that's most obvious. The massive use of chemicals in our food production, whether those chemicals are fertilizers or herbicides or pesticides, those are all examples of the technologies that we're using to sustain our lives, to keep our lifestyle going, that are very damaging to the environment. Quite aside from our consumption or how many of us there are, the fact that we're doing so much damage with these technologies. And, you know, the essay, the last essay there, the oldest task in human history, if you notice that essay, Leopold gave that essay as a speech at the engineering college on campus. And I picked, you know, one of the milder parts. What that talk was really about in the essay is taking engineers to task for using technology in a damaging sort of way to solve environmental problems. Said technology is just going in the wrong direction. Technology is not respecting the environment in the direction that it's going. It was one of the few cases that Leopold really kind of, you know, got on a soapbox and took an audience, the engineers on campus, to task.
Sue and I, when we lived. Okay. When Sue and I lived out in Nebraska, we went out to see the sandhill cranes out in, on the Platte River and that. And it's amazing how all these birds, you know, you see them around here, but there, when you go out to the Platte River and when they fly up from New Mexico and things like that, to migrate up to the rest of the North America here, how many birds are you can hardly see the sky sometimes, and the Platte River is just full of them, and it's fantastic to see it. Now, I wonder how those birds are still doing now.
Well, let's get closer to home. You don't have to go to Nebraska to see that. Now, the sandhill cranes have recovered from, in the 1930s, Leopold wrote one of his more poignant essays called Marshland Elegy, in which, despite the fact that the Migratory Bird Treaty Act had protected sandhill cranes, by the 1930s, there are just a few dozen of them left in the upper Midwest. And Leopold wrote this sort of poignant essay anticipating that sandhill cranes were going to disappear from the upper Midwest. Now, sandhill cranes in the upper Midwest have basically saturated the place. There's literally sandhill cranes everywhere in the state of Wisconsin and Michigan, and increasingly in surrounding states. Why did that happen? Well, it was one of the success stories of protection. It was the Migratory Bird Treaty Act that protected those birds and eventually allowed them, with their slow rate of reproduction. So if you want to see sandhill cranes by the tens of thousands, you don't have to go to Nebraska. You can come up each fall to the Leopold Center, up right behind the shack on the Wisconsin River, and see 10,000 cranes roosting there, something Aldo Leopold could never have imagined would happen. And there it is. So, you know, success stories from protection, success stories from management, success stories from environmentalism, they exist. It's not as though they were total failures. They did achieve some great things, but they weren't alone sufficient for the magnitude of the problems. But feel free, how many of you visited the sandhill crane? Well, a few of you. It's a spectacular show. It's the difference between 10,000 cranes and 100,000 cranes. The difference between Wisconsin and Nebraska is sort of almost imperceptible. 10,000 cranes is still a lot of cranes to have in one spot at one time. So from October through December, the Leopold Foundation invites the public to come, and I lead tours, and we have a good time.
Before we thank Professor Temple, I wanted to just talk a little bit about next week and the week after. We'll be back here on May 2nd May 7th, sorry, in 2 weeks, and we'll hear from Boy Scout Troop 104 that's housed here at Midvale, and they're going to kind of tell us what they're up to. So I think that's good. Next week is our 70th anniversary celebration, and I have been asked to read a note from the Awe Committee. The Awe Committee art team encourages the congregation to view the new art exhibit in celebration of Midvale's 70th anniversary. Jesus Images of Change is the name of the exhibit. Art will be found in the gathering space, main floor hallway, and in the fellowship hall. The exhibit will focus on 4 different periods of art: images of Jesus from the 1800s, 1950s through 70s, 1980s until the present, and featuring new purchases from 2021 of art created by Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC. As you walk through, please think about the posted comments and questions that will help you appreciate this exhibit. So thanks. And then Professor Temple, thank you so much. This is a really great talk. I
Welcome.
appreciate it.